The FDA inspects the bottled water you're drinking right now once every 5 years on average. That bottle of water on your desk represents a $47 billion trust system where the Food and Drug Administration largely doesn't test the water itself. They test the paperwork. When you crack the seal, you're assuming the liquid inside has been rigorously tested and verified safe by federal agencies. You probably think bottled water faces stricter regulations than your kitchen tap water. But that isn't how bottled water is actually checked. Follow an FDA inspector into a bottling plant today, and you'll discover something you wouldn't expect. The inspector isn't there to test the water. They're not carrying sample vials or running chemical tests. They walk past the production line, past the filtration systems, and head straight to a filing cabinet in the back office. This creates a regulatory blind spot covering a $47 billion industry governed by 21 CFR Part 129, the Code of Federal Regulations that allows bottled water companies to largely police themselves. To understand why we're seeing sudden spikes in recalls from black particles in distilled water to bacterial contamination in premium brands, we need to examine the gap between how the EPA regulates utilities versus how the FDA treats food products. This isn't about whether bottled water is dangerous. It's about how a system built on self-reporting behaves when scaled to handle 50 billion gallons of liquid under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The Sweet Springs Valley Water incident in West Virginia reveals how FDA oversight actually works. The facility bottled and distributed water for months, churning out identical plastic bottles under their standard production model. When an FDA inspector finally arrived, they didn't discover contamination by testing the water. They found it in a logbook. The facility's own records showed they detected E. coli in their source water months earlier. Good manufacturing practices required stopping production immediately and running 5 clean tests over 24 hours before resuming. But the logs showed the line never stopped. The contaminated water shipped out anyway. Here's what matters most. The FDA inspector, standing there with proof that contaminated water entered the supply chain, didn't immediately mandate a recall. They noted the violation and filed paperwork. By the time the bureaucratic process closed that loop, people had already consumed the water. This illustrates what I call the paperwork paradigm. Bottled water regulation is retroactive, looking backward at company-generated data. It's not real-time monitoring. It's an audit system that relies entirely on the honesty of the company being audited, with the International Bottled Water Association promoting industry self-regulation standards. The root lies in legal classification. Tap water falls under EPA regulation as a utility through the Safe Drinking Water Act. Bottled water gets regulated by the FDA's Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition as food under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. This bureaucratic distinction changes everything about oversight. Municipal water plants serve as centralized health choke points for entire cities. The EPA's total coliform rule requires aggressive, continuous monitoring. A typical city water system must test for coliform bacteria over 100 times every month. These tests are mandatory, public, and rigidly scheduled with maximum contaminant levels strictly enforced. Switch to bottling plants under FDA jurisdiction, and those requirements plummet. That same coliform testing the EPA demands daily, the FDA requires it once per week under 21 CFR Part 129. Think about the volume flowing through high-speed bottling lines in 7 days. A single line produces 30,000 bottles per hour. Between mandatory bacterial tests, a factory could produce and ship millions of units. If a filter fails Tuesday and the next test isn't until Friday, that entire production run exists in a regulatory gray zone. The inspection gap widens further. Municipal water faces constant reporting and frequent audits. The Government Accountability Office found bottled water plants get inspected by the FDA once every 5 3/4 years on average. In 5 years, a factory can change its source, filtration systems, management, and entire piping layout. A facility could theoretically operate for half a decade without a federal inspector ever walking the floor. Between 2008 and 2018, inspection frequency actually declined 33% as the industry grew larger and faster. This creates compliance by assumption. The FDA assumes companies follow good manufacturing practices. Companies assume their equipment works properly. Consumers assume the government checks everything. This chain only breaks when someone physically detects something wrong, like black particles in distilled water, or when a paperwork audit years later reveals past failures. But there's a deeper layer most consumers never realize. Geography matters under interstate commerce regulations. Federal FDA regulations only apply to products crossing state lines. If a company pumps water in Texas, bottles it in Texas, and sells it exclusively in Texas, that product largely escapes FDA jurisdiction. Roughly 70% of bottled water sold in America falls into this category. It never crosses state lines, so it never enters federal regulatory oversight. Your bottle's safety depends entirely on which state you're standing in. The system isn't a monolith, it's a patchwork. Some states like California mirror FDA standards through rigorous environmental departments. Others like Texas rely heavily on self-reporting and barely regulate bottled water at all. 12 states don't require certified laboratories for microbiological testing, meaning lab results might come from unaccredited internal labs with zero external validation. 20 states don't require companies to report violations to health departments. If tests come back positive for contaminants, companies document it but don't tell the government. The information sits in filing cabinets, waiting for FDA inspectors who might not arrive for 5 more years. This creates regulatory latency, enforcement mechanisms years behind the science. Consider DEHP, diethylhexyl phthalate, a plasticizer classified as a probable carcinogen. The EPA set strict DEHP maximum contaminant levels for tap water in 1992, requiring immediate municipal compliance. The FDA got deferred action status, postponing the same standard for bottled water for 16 years. Until 2012, bottled water could legally contain carcinogen levels that would be illegal in gas station tap water. That same delay is happening right now with PFAS, the forever chemicals that don't break down. In April 2024, the EPA set maximum contaminant levels of 4 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFOS in tap water, forcing cities to start upgrading filtration systems. Bottled water didn't get the same update from the FDA's Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. There's still no federal requirement to test or filter bottled water for these forever chemicals. Some companies do it voluntarily, others don't. Which means we're in a moment where the water coming out of your kitchen tap can be held to a stricter chemical standard than the bottled water sold as a premium product. This brings us to nanoplastics, the most significant recent discovery. In January 2024, Columbia University researchers used stimulated Raman scattering microscopy to analyze bottled water. They didn't just find plastic particles, they found 250,000 plastic particles per liter, 10 to 100 times previous estimates. The critical insight isn't just contamination, it's the discovery method. This didn't come from FDA inspection or industry quality control. It came from independent academia using technology regulators don't possess. Current FDA regulatory frameworks search for known contaminants using established methods. They look for E. coli using standard cultures, arsenic using standard spectrometry. They don't look for nanoplastics because there's no column for it in the 21 CFR Part 129 paperwork. The system catches failures from the past, not emerging variables of the present. This technological gap explains why contamination events get discovered by accident. Real water, a premium alkaline product, wasn't pulled because FDA inspectors found hydrazine in tanks. It was pulled because people started experiencing acute liver failure. The recall got triggered by casualty count, not compliance checks. The same pattern appears in the massive Fiji water recall of 1.9 million bottles. Contamination, manganese, and bacteria was discovered only after product reached deep into supply chains. The recall reacted to failure rather than preventing it. Recent recalls of Meyer, Gerolsteiner, and Topo Chico don't represent sudden hygiene collapse. They represent statistical inevitability of self-policing systems operating at maximum capacity. As production speeds increase to meet $50 billion of demand, error margins narrow. A filtration membrane used one day too long, a UV light dimming slightly, or friction during cap sealing. These small mechanical variables cascade into millions of compromised units before weekly FDA-mandated tests catch them. The industry creates medical-grade illusions through sterile packaging, blue labeling, and words like purified and distilled. These semiotic signals convey clinical safety, but regulatory reality under the Food Safety Modernization Act treats bottled water more like potato chips than medicine. How do you navigate this? Start by dismantling the assumption that bottled equals FDA checked. Recognize that water safety depends largely on specific company culture, not federal oversight. You're trusting brands' desire to avoid lawsuits, not FDA inspection capabilities. Understand that regulated is flexible. When companies claim their water is fully regulated under 21 CFR Part 129, they're technically correct. They have files and logbooks and compliance paperwork. But as West Virginia showed, you can have perfect paperwork with E. coli in the pipes. This reframes tap water's value proposition. Municipal water gets criticized for taste or pipe infrastructure, but from a data standpoint, it's the most transparent beverage you can drink under EPA oversight. You can check exactly what was found in your city's water last month. See daily testing logs under the total coliform rule. That data density simply doesn't exist for bottled water under FDA jurisdiction. When you buy bottled water, you're paying for portability, convenience, and consistent taste that engineered sameness. You're not necessarily paying for higher safety standards than EPA-regulated tap water. The gap between EPA and FDA oversight, between weekly tests and daily flow, between paperwork and liquid, these spaces let the system breathe. And in these spaces, contaminants like nanoplastics detected by stimulated Raman scattering microscopy, bacteria, and chemical byproducts survive. Next time you see an FDA recall alert, don't view it as a freak accident. View it as the system briefly showing its hand, a moment where liquid reality caught up with paperwork latency under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The bottle in your hand represents logistical marvel, engineering precision, and marketing sophistication. But it's not a sterile capsule isolated from industrial errors. It's a food product monitored by filing cabinets in a system where the FDA assumes everything's fine until it isn't. Understanding this regulatory mechanism transforms you from passive consumer to active supply chain analyst. You stop trusting labels and start watching systems.